Have you ever opened your front door and realized in that very moment that your entire day was about to change forever? That happened to me on a quiet Saturday morning when someone began pounding on my door so loud that even my daughter came running from the backyard asking what was going on. When I opened the door, I saw a man standing there with a fake badge on his belt that said HOA security, and his very first words were not hello, not good morning, not can we talk. No, his first words were a threat. He told me I was in violation and that this was my last warning. Right then I knew something was wrong because my home was perfectly fine and I had nothing to hide. But what he did not know is that my wife is a federal agent, and what happened next turned into a story that shook the entire neighborhood. You do not want to miss how this played out because it is going to make you rethink everything about fake HOA power. Before I dive in, make sure you hit subscribe and drop a comment below if you have ever had to deal with someone trying to act tougher than they really are. There are certain days in life when everything feels normal at first, but by the end of the day you realize that nothing will ever feel the same again. This story begins on a Saturday morning. The kind of Saturday when the air feels calm and the sunlight paints the entire neighborhood with a golden glow. The kind of day when you want to relax with your family and forget about all the little stresses of the week. I woke up early that morning. The sound of birds filled the air outside the window. My daughter was already awake and she was in the backyard with her toys. She loved playing with her small plastic castle and her stuffed animals. Her laughter drifted through the open glass door and it gave me a sense of peace. Inside the kitchen, the smell of coffee spread slowly. My wife stood near the counter with her mug in hand. She always liked to enjoy a few quiet minutes before the day officially began. I joined her at the table with a stack of mail that I had ignored all week. Bills, advertisements, nothing important. Felt like any other ordinary morning. The world was quiet. The neighborhood was calm. I thought the day would continue in this peaceful rhythm. But life has a way of shifting without warning. Sometimes a single sound can break the comfort of a perfect morning. For me, that sound was 3 heavy knocks on the front door. The knocks were so loud that the dishes on the shelf rattled. My daughter stopped laughing outside and came running and asking what happened. Even my wife looked up with a raised eyebrow. These were not normal knocks. They were not friendly. They were the kind of knocks that carried weight. The kind that made you feel that someone was demanding attention. I set down the mail and walked toward the door. My chest already felt tight. I placed my hand on the knob and opened the door slowly. On the other side stood a man I had never seen before. He looked like he wanted to project authority. He wore a black polo shirt tucked into cargo pants. A shiny badge was clipped to his belt, but it was not a police badge. It said HOA security in bold letters. His stance was firm. His chin was slightly raised. His eyes scanned me as if I was guilty before I even spoke. The first words out of his mouth were sharp. He did not say hello. He did not say good morning. He did not introduce himself. Instead, he said that I was in violation of HOA rules. He said this was my last warning. I stood there confused for a second. My mind replayed his words. Violation. Last warning. I asked him what he meant. He said that my lawn decorations were against the rules. He said that the gatherings at my house had been reported. He said that the board had already discussed me. Now let me explain something about my home. Keep it clean. The lawn is cut every week. The driveway is clear. My family is respectful to every neighbor around us. The only gathering we held was my daughter's birthday party. A few children played in the yard. There was cake. There were balloons. There was nothing wild or disruptive. So when this man stood on my porch and accused me of violations, I knew something was wrong. I told him that I wanted to see the rule I had broken. He did not answer. He smirked instead. It was the kind of smirk that people use when they think they have all the power. He leaned slightly forward and lowered his voice. He told me that if I did not cooperate, the board would take further action. He said the board could make my life miserable. In that moment, I felt anger rising inside me. This was my house. This was my family. No one had the right to stand here and speak to me like this. I told him firmly that I did not accept threats on my own doorstep. I reminded him that he was not a real officer. I reminded him that his badge meant nothing outside of the neighborhood association. For a second, his face changed. The smirk faded just a little. But then he tried to recover. He laughed lightly as if to brush it off. He said that people like me always regret challenging the HOA. He said I should not make things harder. Before I could respond, I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. My wife stepped onto the porch. She held her mug of coffee in one hand. Her eyes were calm but sharp. She looked at me and then at him. In that instant, the entire atmosphere shifted. The man had no idea who she was. He had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. My wife stood still for a moment and sipped her coffee as if she had walked into a scene that she already understood. She had a calm energy that made people nervous. She did not need to shout or wave her arms. Her silence alone carried power. The man shifted slightly when he noticed her. He tried to maintain his posture, but I could see his shoulders tense. She asked him a simple question. She said, "Who are you?" Her tone was flat and steady. Not curious. Not friendly. It was a question that demanded truth. The man answered that he was with HOA security. He tapped the badge on his belt as if that small piece of metal gave him authority. She asked him to show his credentials. He blinked. He hesitated for half a second. He repeated that he was with HOA security, but he did not move to show anything. Her eyes narrowed just a little. She repeated her request. She said, "Show me proof. Show me identification. Show me who gave you the authority to stand on this porch and make threats." The man looked at me, then back at her. He tried to laugh. He said he did not need to show anything. He said we knew what the rules were. He said our violations were already noted. He said the board was ready to act. My wife set her coffee mug on the porch railing. She took one step closer. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. She said, "You are trespassing." She said, "You have no right to stand here and intimidate my family." She said, "If you cannot prove authority, then you will leave now." The man's smirk disappeared completely. I watched as he swallowed hard. Sweat formed at his hairline. His fake confidence cracked like glass under pressure. He fumbled with his badge. He turned it slightly as if trying to make it look official. But even from a distance, it was obvious. It was a cheap piece of metal. It had no government seal. It had no legal power. From the corner of my eye, I saw a curtain move across the street. A neighbor was watching. Another neighbor stepped out onto their lawn holding a watering can, but their eyes were fixed on us. The scene was no longer private. The man knew this. He was being watched. He tried to shift the conversation. He said he was only following orders. He said the HOA board wanted strict enforcement. He said he was here to protect the value of the neighborhood. But his voice had lost its edge. It sounded weaker. It sounded like someone trying to hold onto authority that was slipping away. My wife tilted her head. She asked him who gave the order. She asked for the name. She asked for the paper. She asked for the law. Every word cut deeper into his act. He could not answer. He stammered. He looked around as if searching for a way out. At that moment, I realized something important. He had come here expecting fear. He had come here expecting submission. He thought we would bow to his fake authority. But instead, he was facing someone who saw through him instantly. He was facing someone who lived every day exposing lies. He was facing my wife. The silence stretched. He had no words. He had no power left. And yet he still stood there. His pride kept him from leaving. His fear kept him frozen. The air was heavy. The neighbors continued to watch. Every second that passed made his position worse. I looked at my wife and I knew she was about to end this. The silence on the porch grew heavy. The man tried to stand tall, but his body betrayed him. His jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff. A bead of sweat slid down his temple and he wiped it quickly with the back of his hand as if no one would notice. But I noticed. My wife noticed. Even the neighbors watching noticed. My wife kept her eyes locked on him. She did not blink often. She had a way of staring through people that made them uncomfortable. She asked again in the same calm voice, "Show me your credentials. Show me your authority. Show me anything that proves you belong here." The man shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He glanced at the badge on his belt. He touched it with his fingers as though holding onto it might give him real power. He muttered that the board did not require him to show paperwork. He said his word was enough. My wife leaned forward slightly. Her voice lowered, but it carried across the porch like a blade. She said, "In this country, authority is not built on words. It is built on law. If you cannot show law, you are lying. If you cannot show documentation, you are trespassing." The man swallowed hard. His throat moved. He forced out a nervous laugh. He looked over his shoulder toward the street as if hoping someone would step in to help him. But no one did. The neighbors kept watching silently, some with crossed arms, some with phones in their hands, recording perhaps, waiting for the moment when the truth revealed itself. I felt the tension rise inside me. I stepped closer beside my wife. I told the man that we were done listening to his empty words. I said, "Leave now or face consequences." My voice was firm. My chest felt tight with anger, but I kept control. He lifted his hands slightly in defense. He said, "Wait." He said he was not trying to cause trouble. He said he was only following orders. He repeated that phrase again. Following orders. As if that excuse would shield him from accountability. My wife raised one eyebrow. She asked him who gave the order. She asked for a name. She asked for a direct source. She asked if the board had signed documents. She asked if he had proof of assignment. Each question struck him like a hammer. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He had nothing. The street grew quieter. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. All eyes were on him. He realized that his performance had collapsed. The image of authority he tried to project was shattered. The neighbors now saw him not as a protector of the community but as a fraud. A bully. A man who enjoyed power only when no one challenged him. He took one step back. His shoes scraped against the porch. His breathing grew heavier. His hands twitched slightly at his sides. He said again that he did not want trouble. He said maybe there had been a mistake. He said maybe the paperwork was delayed. He said maybe the board would explain later. His words spilled out in a rush. Excuses piling on top of excuses. My wife did not move. She did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She said, "You came to this house to threaten my family. You came here to intimidate us. You stood on this porch and pretended to be something you are not. Now the neighbors know. Now your lies are exposed. And you have two choices. Leave this property immediately or face the consequences of federal law." The moment those words left her mouth, the man froze. Federal law. The weight of that phrase crashed down on him. He looked at her differently now. He studied her face. He studied her stance. And for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. The kind that makes a man realize he is standing on dangerous ground. He whispered quietly. He asked who she was. He asked what gave her the right to speak of federal law. My wife smiled faintly. Not a warm smile. A sharp smile. She said, "I am with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." She said, "I deal with people like you every day." She said, "If you take one more step on this property without legal authority, you will be in handcuffs before the hour ends." The man stumbled back a step. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His face drained of color. His hands shook slightly. He tried to say something, but his voice cracked. He muttered that he would check with the board. He muttered that this was all a misunderstanding. He muttered that he would return later with clarification. He turned quickly and walked down the steps of the porch. His pace was fast now, almost a jog. He reached his car and fumbled with the handle before sliding inside. The engine roared to life. He drove off without looking back. The silence that followed was powerful. The neighbors across the street lowered their curtains. The ones standing outside shook their heads. One even clapped softly as if justice had just been served. I looked at my wife. She picked up her mug from the railing. She took a calm sip. Then she said one single word. Pathetic. The sound of his car engine fading down the street left an echo in my ears. It was not just the sound of retreat. It was the sound of a man who had walked onto the wrong property with the wrong plan. He had come to intimidate. He had come to assert power. Yet he left exposed and broken. I stood still on the porch for a long moment. My fists were clenched without me realizing it. My chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. My wife remained calm as always. She held her mug close and sipped again. The steam curled upward into the cool morning air. Her eyes were steady, her face unreadable. She was already moving on while I was still burning with anger. From the corner of my eye, I saw the neighbor across the street. The curtain moved again and the figure disappeared quickly as if afraid of being noticed. Another neighbor 2 houses down stayed outside with a watering can still in hand. The water spilled onto the ground unnoticed as his gaze remained locked on us. When our eyes met, he gave a small nod. A nod of respect. A nod that said, "We saw what you did and we know who you are now." 2 children rode their bikes down the sidewalk and slowed when they passed our house. One of them whispered something to the other. Their voices carried in the still air. They said that the man looked scared. They said it was strange to see an adult run away like that. Even the children understood what had happened. My daughter stepped forward from behind the doorway. She looked confused. She asked if everything was all right. I bent down to her level and told her not to worry. I told her that some people pretend to be more important than they are. I told her that honesty always wins. She smiled faintly, though I could see the question still lingering in her young eyes. She hugged my leg tightly before running back to the backyard. The porch itself seemed to hold the memory of the event. The wooden boards beneath my feet felt charged with energy. The railing carried the faint mark of where my wife had rested her mug. The air smelled faintly of sweat left behind by the nervous man. Even after he was gone, his presence lingered like a shadow. My wife broke the silence with a calm statement. She said he will not stop here. She said men like him rarely accept defeat. She said he would report back to the board and the board would try another method. Her tone was not worried. It was certain. She knew the rhythm of intimidation. She had seen it in many forms during her work. She recognized the cycle. I asked her what we should do. She looked at me and said, "We wait. We stay calm. We watch. And when they return, we will be ready." Her voice carried the weight of strategy. She was already thinking several moves ahead while I was still standing in the first battle. The sun had risen higher by now. The shadows stretched across the street. The morning no longer felt peaceful, felt charged, felt like the neighborhood itself had changed. Where once there was quiet harmony, there was now a silent buzz of curiosity. Every house seemed awake. Every window seemed to hide eyes. The story was already spreading without words. I sat down on the porch step. My hands were still shaking slightly. I thought about how fast things had escalated. Just minutes earlier, I was sipping coffee and listening to birds. Now my blood was hot and my mind restless. I replayed his smirk, his threats, his sudden collapse when my wife revealed herself. It all replayed like a scene in slow motion. I knew one thing with certainty. The battle with the HOA was far from over. Today was only the first move. They had tested us. They had sent their so-called security to see if fear would work. It had failed. But people who hunger for control rarely give up after one attempt. They come back harder. They come back louder. And they make mistakes when they do. My wife placed her hand on my shoulder. She said, "Let them come." She said, "We are not alone." She said, "Truth will always reveal itself." Her touch grounded me. Her words calmed me. As we stood there together on that porch, I realized something powerful. The HOA thought they were dealing with ordinary homeowners. They thought fear would bend us. They thought their false authority would silence us. But they were wrong. They had no idea who they were up against. The sun had barely set that evening when the first sign of their retaliation appeared. It came not in the form of another visit, not in the form of a knock at the door. It came quietly. A white envelope slipped into my mailbox without a stamp. The kind of envelope that travels only a short distance. The kind of envelope that never touches the post office. I pulled it out slowly and already felt the weight of something wrong. My name was typed in block letters across the front. No greeting. No return address. Just a cold label like an order tag. My wife took it from me and held it to the light. She could see through faint outlines of papers inside. She told me to open it carefully. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. The first was a notice of violation. According to the board, I had broken 3 rules of the community. The grass length was not within regulation. My trash bins were left visible for too long. And my porch light was apparently too bright. None of it was true. My lawn was neat. My bins were hidden behind a fence. My light was no brighter than anyone else's. The second sheet was more threatening. It stated that continued violations would result in fines. If unpaid, those fines could lead to a lien against my property. And if left unresolved, the board reserved the right to escalate to legal action. The language was sharp. It was designed to scare. It was written to remind me of their supposed power. I felt my jaw tighten. My wife read it silently, then set it down on the table. She smiled faintly, not a smile of joy, a smile of recognition. She said, "This is classic escalation." She said, "When intimidation fails, they turn to paper weapons. They use letters and fines like clubs." She said she had seen the same tactics in organized groups that try to dominate through rules and fear. I asked her what we should do. She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. She said, "We document everything." She said, "We respond calmly." She said, "We prepare for them to come again." Her voice carried no fear, only strategy. The next morning I noticed something else. The same neighbors who had watched the scene unfold were now whispering when I passed. Some nodded in quiet support. Others avoided my eyes. And a few smiled too eagerly, as if they knew something I did not. Word had traveled fast. The board had already started spreading their version of the story. They wanted the neighborhood to see me as a problem. They wanted to paint me as a rule breaker. Later that day, another envelope arrived. This time it was slipped under my door. No knock, no sound, just paper sliding across the floor. Inside was a handwritten note. It said, "Stop resisting." It said, "Pay the fines." It said, "Remember who is in charge." The handwriting was rushed, aggressive, almost shaking. My wife studied it closely. She said this was personal. She said someone on the board had written it themselves. That night, the tension in the house felt heavy. Every creak of the floorboard sounded louder. Every shadow outside the window seemed suspicious. I sat by the window with the porch light glowing strong. I watched the street as if waiting for them to appear again. My wife stayed calm. She brewed tea. She read her files. But every so often her eyes flicked to the window too. She knew it was only a matter of time. The following evening it happened. A black SUV rolled slowly into the neighborhood. Its headlights dimmed, parked across the street and did not move. Two figures sat inside. They did not step out. They did not knock. They only watched. Hours passed. Midnight came. They were still there. I felt anger rising. I wanted to confront them. My wife stopped me. She placed her hand on my chest and shook her head. She whispered that this was surveillance. She whispered that they wanted a reaction. She whispered that the strongest move was patience. So we waited. At 2 in the morning, the SUV finally started. The engine rumbled low and then it drove away. The street returned to silence. But the message was clear. They were not done. They were watching. The black SUV became the new shadow in our lives. It arrived without fanfare and it left without warning. It rolled into the neighborhood late at night and parked 2 houses down where a street light barely reached. From our porch, it looked like a dark rock against the pavement. We watched it for hours through the blinds and through the curtains. At first we thought it might be coincidence. Then the second night it returned. Then the third. Each time the engine stayed idle and the headlights remained off. The driver and passenger remained motionless in their seats. They did not step out. They did not walk to a nearby house. They simply watched the houses as if reading a list of names. The car was a message. It was designed to unsettle without violence. It worked. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Text messages popped up in group chats. People asked if anyone else had seen the same SUV. Photos were shared with timestamps. Some neighbors claimed they had seen a different car earlier in the week parked at the corner. Others said they had noticed someone taking pictures of homes during daylight. The mood changed from polite small talk to quiet nervous glances. Lawn mowers stopped mid-stroke when cars slowed down in front of houses. Dogs barked more on their evening walks. Something invisible had moved between the homes like a low wind. Inside our house, the silence became heavy. My daughter asked questions that I could not answer. She wanted to know why the man had come. She wanted to know if he would return. I told her simple truths. I said we were safe. I said we were together. I did not tell her about the SUVs or the envelopes or the notes. I tried to keep her world small and bright. My wife took a more methodical approach. She turned the worry into work. She began to document everything. She photographed the envelopes. She scanned the typed notices. She wrote down the times when the SUV appeared and when it left. She recorded audio of the soft creaks outside the house late at night. Each small piece of evidence became a brick in a wall we were building around ourselves. Neighbors started to approach us with small offerings of help. One man from 2 houses down left a handwritten note at our door offering to watch the street. Another neighbor came by with a cup of coffee and stood awkwardly for a minute before fading back to their own home. A woman with a stroller stopped on the sidewalk and asked if we had any extra trash bags. Her eyes showed concern and not curiosity. When we told her about the envelopes and the SUV, she said she had seen similar things in other neighborhoods and that these tactics were common in power plays. Her voice was low and firm. The support comforted us even while the fear persisted. The HOA board did not respond directly at first. Their silence felt deliberate. Days passed and the letters continued to arrive. Each envelope contained a different tone. Some were formal and dry. Others were petty and sharply worded. One contained a photograph of our front yard with a tiny circled area and a typed caption noting an alleged violation. The picture was grainy and the circled area was ambiguous. It felt like a mockery more than evidence. My wife studied the photograph and found the metadata lacking. There was no timestamp embedded. The image could have been taken from any angle at any time. Yet it was meant to humiliate. I began to feel the weight of how quickly a community can turn. Small slights become large resentments. Old neighbors who once waved in passing now crossed the street to avoid conversation. Rumors filled the air like dust. Some people whispered that we had provoked the board. Others assumed we were the problem. A few brave souls stood solidly with us. They met our eye when we passed. They brought food to the porch. They offered to sit outside at odd hours. Their solidarity helped stitch the tear that the board had started to widen. At night, the house felt different. Lights were left on in the living room long after the television went dark. The blinds were closed earlier than usual. My wife installed a small camera near the front door. It was a simple device that recorded motion and timestamps. The footage showed the SUV coming and leaving. It showed a figure lingering at the end of the driveway at odd hours. It did not show the faces clearly. The resolution blurred the details. But every time the camera caught the SUV, it added another documented line to our collection of proof. We saved each clip and labeled them by date and time. We also began to plan. My wife drew up a list of phone calls to make. She spoke with a trusted friend at work who suggested legal avenues. He advised us to compile the evidence and to avoid direct confrontation until we had counsel. He reminded us that escalation was often what bullies wanted. My wife listened and made notes in a small black notebook. She called a local attorney who specialized in property law and intimidation. The attorney recommended sending a formal letter to the HOA and to preserve the evidence in multiple formats. He asked for copies of the envelopes and the typed notices. He asked for any witnesses who had seen the SUV. We prepared everything carefully and mailed a certified letter that outlined our concerns and requested a formal response. The HOA replied quickly after receiving the certified letter. Their response was brief and perfunctory. They stated that they were investigating complaints about our property. They said they would follow the rules and that homeowners had to abide by the community standards. They denied any surveillance. They claimed they had no authority to enter private property. Their words were neat and calculated. The contradiction between the polite letter and the thinly veiled pressure from their agents was clear to us. We read the letter out loud together and then placed it in the folder with the photographs and recordings. Despite the legal correspondence, the SUV returned. It seemed undeterred by the formal tone of paper and law. One evening it pulled into view at dusk and parked just beyond the circle of streetlight. The driver sat and watched as evening activities wrapped up. A neighbor who had not been involved before stepped outside and stared straight at the vehicle. The driver rolled down the window for only a heartbeat and then rolled it back up. The neighbor did not flinch. He walked slower to his car the next morning. He made calls. He talked quietly to others on the block. Small actions multiplied. The SUV problem that had started as an intimidation tactic was now forcing neighbors to wake up and notice who they shared their street with. Rumors reached us that the board had been meeting more frequently. Voices in the grocery store line said they had seen the familiar faces on the committee whispering together. Others claimed board emails circulated late at night. We did not have direct proof of these private conversations, but the rhythm of their actions suggested coordination. The same envelopes slipping into mailboxes, the same notes left with the same writing. The pattern suggested planning and design. Our social feeds turned into a record. Photos of the SUV and of envelopes were posted with captions asking for help. People tagged each other and asked simple questions. Have you seen this car? Did you get an envelope? The messages multiplied and spread beyond our street. A local community page shared our story. The comments were a mixture of sympathy and caution. Some warned us to be careful. Others advised de-escalation. A few suggested posting signs asserting private property and warning trespassers. We considered each idea and then decided to move carefully. We did not want to inflame the situation without legal advice. One neighbor suggested we hold a small meeting to discuss the pattern. It would be informal and within the safety of daylight hours. The idea was to bring people together who had noticed unusual activity and to form a small watch team. My wife supported this plan. She believed that visibility and community action could counter the isolation the board hoped to create. We posted a polite flyer on the community board and a message in the neighborhood chat. The turnout surprised us. People arrived with cups of coffee and wary expressions. Some looked angry. Others looked exhausted. The meeting became a place to share evidence and to exchange contact information. People who had been quiet finally spoke. They described their own similar experiences in private messages. One older woman recounted how a man had approached her last month asking about trash cans. Another man showed a photograph of an SUV with a partial license plate number. The small gathering felt like the first real step away from fear. The board reacted to the meeting in predictable fashion. An email circulated that the meeting was unauthorized. Some accused the organizers of spreading panic. Others warned that gatherings could violate community rules about assemblies. The tension rose once again. The board sent a representative to the next neighborhood watch meeting. He wore a suit and he spoke with practiced calm. He told the group that the HOA only wanted to ensure community standards. He denied any surveillance. He promised to investigate any complaints fairly. His voice was smooth. It did not match the actions of the envelopes or of the SUV. Still, some neighbors felt reassured. Others left feeling that the words were empty. Our attorney advised that we continue to document and avoid direct confrontation. He suggested obtaining a restraining order only if the SUV returned and remained in a harassing pattern. He recommended notifying local law enforcement about the patterns and providing them with our evidence. We followed his advice and made a report at the local precinct. The officer who took the report listened carefully and wrote down the dates and times. He said he would forward the information to patrol units. He explained that proving harassment required consistency and documentation. He thanked us for being thorough and warned us to avoid escalating with our own actions. His tone was professional and his presence felt reassuring. As weeks passed, the SUV incidents continued to ebb and flow. Sometimes scenes repeated nightly. Sometimes a week would pass without incident. The unpredictability stretched nerves thin. Each ring of a car horn or a late-night engine sparked a jolt of adrenaline. Simple tasks like taking out the trash or walking the dog became calculations. The neighborhood shifted shape. People changed routines and checked lights twice before bedtime. Children who once played freely began to be shepherded more closely. The invisible pressure of watching had altered the rhythm of a place that used to feel safe. The strange presence of the SUV began to create cracks between neighbors. The silence that had once been filled with greetings and small talk was now replaced with suspicion. Every time a car slowed near the cul-de-sac, curtains shifted in unison. Parents began walking their children to the bus stop instead of letting them go alone. Evening barbecues that used to be loud and friendly now ended earlier. Conversations carried a sharp edge. People wanted to talk about the SUV, but they also wanted to avoid it. Fear hung in the air like a fog. I noticed the change most during the mornings. I used to wave to my neighbor across the street while I collected the newspaper. Now he barely lifted his head. He walked quickly back inside, clutching his mail. Another neighbor who had always asked about my daughter suddenly stopped visiting. She now crossed the street when walking her dog. The SUV had not only unsettled the community, it had poisoned trust. My wife remained calm and methodical. She recorded everything, and she continued to reassure me that fear was part of the board's plan. She reminded me that intimidation works only when it isolates its target. She believed the board wanted me to feel alone. She believed they wanted me to crumble under the weight of suspicion. She told me not to fall into their trap. Her words helped, but my chest still carried the heaviness of watching eyes. The SUV returned again and again. It did not always stay long. Sometimes it lingered for only 10 minutes. Other nights it stayed for hours. Its windows were tinted dark enough to hide the faces inside. The headlights never came on. The engine hummed low. On one particular night, I walked to the window and thought I saw the faint glow of a phone screen inside the vehicle. Whoever was watching was taking notes or pictures. The thought tightened my fists. My wife gently pulled me back from the window. She whispered that patience was stronger than anger. She whispered that evidence was more powerful than confrontation. The neighbors who dared to support us began to face their own subtle pressures. One man told me he received a violation notice about the color of his shutters. He had lived in his home for 20 years and had never received a complaint before. Another neighbor confided that her mailbox had been dented overnight. She did not see who did it. She suspected it was not random. People began to understand that the board's reach was not only through letters. It was through small punishments meant to discourage resistance. I began to write in a notebook each night. I documented every sound outside. I wrote the times when engines idled near our street. I listed the names of neighbors who supported us and those who avoided us. The pages filled quickly. Writing gave me the feeling of control. It allowed me to see patterns. It allowed me to understand that intimidation was not invisible. It left marks that could be traced. One night, the SUV parked closer than usual. It stopped directly in front of my driveway. My pulse raced. My hands trembled. My wife lifted her phone and recorded the entire event through the curtain. The vehicle sat for 30 minutes and then rolled away silently. The next morning, we found a small piece of paper under the windshield wiper of my car. It said obey. Just one word in bold black ink. No signature. No explanation. Just a command. That single word spread through the block faster than any rumor. People whispered that the board was sending messages. Some neighbors grew angry. Others grew afraid. A few began to consider selling their homes. The harmony that once defined the neighborhood had been replaced by quiet dread. Every home felt like it was under a microscope. Every homeowner felt like a potential target. My daughter began to notice the tension. She asked why the neighbors were acting strange. She asked why people whispered when we walked past. I struggled to find gentle answers. I told her that sometimes grown-ups forget how to be kind. I told her that we must stay honest and strong. She nodded slowly, but I could see the worry in her young eyes. She clung to my wife more often and avoided playing in the front yard. The SUV had stolen her comfort. Meanwhile, the board pretended to act as if nothing was wrong. Their monthly newsletter arrived neatly printed and cheerful. It spoke of gardening tips and upcoming events. It listed reminders about parking rules. Not a single word acknowledged the growing fear in the community. Not a single word mentioned the surveillance or the envelopes. Their silence was deliberate. They wanted the official record to remain clean while the shadows did the real work. By now, the folders in our home were thick with evidence. My wife labeled each envelope by date. She clipped photographs together. She burned digital copies onto discs. She stored everything in separate places in case one set went missing. Her training showed in every detail. She was preparing not only for a legal fight, but for the possibility that someone would try to erase our records. Despite the fear, something else began to grow. A quiet resistance formed among the braver neighbors. People started leaving lights on longer at night. They began walking in small groups instead of alone. They created a watch schedule where someone was always outside during the evening hours. The board wanted silence. Instead, whispers turned into conversations. Fear began to turn into shared defiance. Still the SUV returned. Still the envelopes arrived. Still the pressure mounted. The stage was being set for something larger. My wife told me it was only a matter of time before the board revealed its next step. She believed they were building toward a public confrontation. She said they would want to make an example out of me. She said they would try to turn the neighborhood fully against me through spectacle. And she was right. The day of the HOA meeting arrived like the moment before a storm. The community hall filled slowly with chairs and murmurs. People lined the walls and stood in doorways. Some faces were curious. Some were tired. Some were angry. The board had placed an agenda on the door that morning. It read in neat type that issues of community compliance would be discussed. The notice sounded ordinary. The energy in the room was not. The envelopes, the SUV, the whispered notes had all pooled into a single current that pushed everyone toward this moment. The board president stood at the front behind a long table and tapped a stack of papers as if to make the room focus. He spoke in practice sentences that were soft and precise. He explained the purpose of the meeting. He thanked the residents for attending. He spoke about standards and community values. He asked for calm. His tone tried to be gentle while his eyes scanned toward me and my wife. He read from a prepared script about compliance and consequences. He avoided the word intimidation. He avoided the envelopes and the SUVs. His silence on those things made the room feel colder. Residents raised hands to speak. Some spoke calmly and asked for clarity about notices. Others spoke with visible frustration and demanded answers about surveillance. A woman who had been quiet for weeks stood and described a dented mailbox. A father explained how his small children had stopped playing outside because of the fear. Each testimony added a layer. Each testimony made it harder for the board to hold the posture of polite neutrality. The energy shifted from scheduled civility toward something rawer and more urgent. When the board called for my turn, I rose slowly. My hands felt damp. My voice at first was steady and measured, as if I wanted to frame the conflict with facts. I described envelopes and typed notices. I described an SUV that arrived and lingered late at night. I described a note on my car that said obey with the single command printed in bold. I explained how the tactics had changed simple days into restless nights. I explained that this was not about lawn care or a porch light. I explained that it was about pressure and fear. The board attempted to respond with polite denials. They said they had no role in surveillance. They said complaints had been filed and that rules needed enforcement. They tried to draw lines between complaint and harassment. A man in a suit who represented the board spoke about procedure. He emphasized documentation and that members should follow complaint channels. His words were neat, but the audience felt them as thin. He did not address the envelopes sliding into mailboxes at night. He did not explain who placed the SUV in parking spaces near houses. His omissions became evidence for anyone listening closely. My wife then stood. The room changed direction in a single breath. She did not yell. She did not need to. Her presence alone altered the room. She walked forward with a small black folder that contained photos, recordings, and a record of dates and times. She laid copies on the table and asked for each board member to look at them. One by one they read. The images showed the SUV parked at the corner. The timestamps matched our camera footage. The envelopes were photographed with distinct handwriting and with paper fibers that matched samples from a printed notice later found in board paperwork. Each image carried the authority of a fact. She explained step by step how the envelopes had been circulated and how the vehicle had been surveilling houses. She spoke about pattern and timing and coordination. She asked direct questions that required direct answers. She asked who authorized the surveillance. She asked who had access to the lists of complaint addresses. She asked who had delivered the unmarked notes. The board shuffled papers. The president blinked. His answers became shorter. The practiced calm that had guided the meeting until now began to unravel. Neighbors reacted openly. Some expressed shock. Others began to murmur. A man in the back who had once avoided eye contact now spoke loudly about how his own mailbox had been tampered with. A pair of young parents explained that their child now feared cars idling late at night. People who had been silent for weeks now stepped forward with evidence. A small cluster of them lifted copies of photos from their phones and placed them on the table where they could not be ignored. The meeting had moved from a debate about regulations into a public accounting of harm. The board attempted to call order. They reminded people about decorum. They asked us to submit formal complaints and to allow them to investigate. The room erupted. Voices overlapped. The hope of a calm procedural answer had faded. People no longer wanted polite replies. They wanted accountability. The board looked panicked. Their careful scripts did not provide answers for photographs or for the growing list of witnesses who had now assembled like pieces of a puzzle. An elderly woman who had watched us from her porch stepped up and handed the board a small sealed envelope. She said she had been too afraid to come forward earlier, but that she watched and that she had seen a familiar sequence of events. Her note contained a partial license plate and a scribbled observation. The moment she spoke, the room shifted again. Fear gave way to clarity. The evidence that had once been scattered now leaned together as a claim that could no longer be ignored. The board president swallowed and asked for a recess. He looked at his colleagues and then at us. He said he would call for a vote to form an independent review committee. His statement was cautious. It sounded like a concession. But people in the room did not accept gestures as sufficient. They demanded that the board immediately cease any enforcement pending an investigation. They demanded transparency on how complaint lists were managed. They demanded the names of anyone granted authority to approach private homes. My wife then made a calm request that the board provide access to their records. She asked that they produce a list of every person who had been authorized to speak to homeowners. She asked for communication logs. She asked that any private investigators be identified. The room listened. The board members exchanged looks. It was clear that some questions could not be answered without exposing a length of coordination that would harm the board's standing. When the votes were finally counted, the motion to form an independent review passed narrowly. A committee would be appointed. The board promised to halt any enforcement actions while the review took place. The room sighed. Some clapped softly. Others remained suspicious. The vote felt less like a victory than like the first step toward a larger war. The SUV had not yet been explained. The envelopes had not yet been traced to a single hand. The pattern had been exposed but not resolved. After the meeting, people lingered in small groups on the hall steps. Conversations were urgent and messy. I heard neighbors agreeing to watch each other's houses to supply updated evidence. I heard someone suggest a neighborhood legal fund. I heard a young woman say she would post the photo of the SUV to every local page until someone recognized the plate. The energy felt like mobilization. It felt like a community pushing back instead of folding. At home that night, the chill in the house felt different. We had not won everything. We had only lit a fire of scrutiny. The folders of evidence sat like armor on the kitchen table. My wife updated the list of dates and added the meeting minutes. She made copies for the attorney. She prepared a timeline. Outside the window, a lone car passed slowly along the street and then turned away. The surveillance had not stopped. The envelopes had not ceased. But a larger group of neighbors now stood with us. The board had promised a review. The mood of the neighborhood had shifted. The next steps would lead into deeper revelations. Names would surface. Communications would be subpoenaed. People who had once been silent would find their voices. The board that had tried to wield power quietly would now be under a new kind of pressure. The meeting had changed the field of play. But the most dangerous moments were yet to come. The independent review began with a quiet formality that felt like a curtain opening on a stage. The committee met in the same community hall where we had argued and pleaded. They sat around a table and they listened as residents laid out timelines and evidence. The members of the committee looked official in their measured tones and in their careful notes. They promised impartiality and they promised to follow the paper trail. For a moment the room breathed easier. Then the slow work of truth started, and that work was not clean or quick. The first task was to gather documents. The committee requested access to board emails, to complaint logs, and to assignments of any private contractors. They asked for receipts and for schedules of patrols. They asked that anyone who had been authorized to approach property owners produce identification and proof of assignment. The board responded at first with hedged language and with the usual claim that privacy laws limited what they could release. Our attorney pushed back and reminded them that transparency was required when allegations of intimidation were serious. The committee set a deadline and the pressure tightened like a wire. As documents arrived, small contradictions began to appear. Meeting minutes had gaps in dates. A list of authorized contractors contained names that did not match any company records. An invoice for a security patrol lacked the usual company header and instead bore a local name that did not have a registration number. The pattern repeated like a stuttering heartbeat. Each inconsistency raised more questions than it answered. The committee members frowned at the printed pages. Residents in the crowd leaned forward. The air tasted like revelation. The first leak came in the form of an old text message. Someone on the board had forwarded a message that was meant to be private. It surfaced in a neighborhood chat and then it traveled outward. The message was short and it revealed that a small group within the board had discussed a plan to encourage compliance through increased presence and through targeted notes. The language had been vague enough to hide intent but clear enough to show coordination. When the message circulated, people reacted with a mixture of shock and anger. That one message changed the tone of defense from denial to scrambling. Pressure mounted on one particular board member. He had once been polite and distant. Now his phone did not stop buzzing. He received calls at odd hours. He stopped attending casual gatherings. He avoided eye contact at the grocery store. Reports began to surface that he had authorized a private contractor under an informal agreement. He claimed innocence at the review hearing under oath, but his story shifted each time new evidence emerged. Small receipts appeared that matched dates when the SUV had been on our block. A neighbor produced a photo of the vehicle near his workplace on a date tied to one of the envelopes. The jigsaw started to assemble itself and the picture was ugly. At the same time, a quieter, startling revelation emerged. A subcontractor who had been hired to manage property inspections came forward as a reluctant witness. He said he had been asked to make friendly visits and to note problem areas. He said that he had been told not to show paperwork and to handle complaints informally. He said he had been handed envelopes with typed notes and instructed to slip them into mailboxes. His voice trembled when he explained that he had been paid in cash. He said he had not wanted to be part of intimidation, but that small communities often have pressure that feels impossible to resist. His testimony carried a new weight because he had been on the inside. The committee subpoenaed more records. They obtained copies of the contractor agreements and traced a pattern of small payments and of informal arrangements. Investigators found a trail that led to a local business that had handled events and decorations. That business had been paid for landscaping and for signage during neighborhood functions. The invoices had lines that looked ordinary, but when examined closely, they contained codes that matched expense categories for private patrols. The discovery did not read like a crime lab revelation. It read like the slow unraveling of a plan carried out by people who thought their hands would remain clean. Neighbors reacted in different ways as the leak spread. Some felt vindicated. They came forward with photos and with recorded conversations. Others felt guilty. They apologized for not speaking up sooner. They confessed that they had been scared into silence by a few pointed comments and by the sense that the board spoke for the entire community. A few still defended the board and said that the intent had been to protect property values. But their voices were smaller now. The consensus shifted toward accountability. The board majority that had once appeared unified now splintered. Accusations flowed behind closed doors and then spilled outward. Meetings grew heated. Friends who had once shared coffee now avoided phone calls. The The small rituals that had kept the association together began to fray. Some board members resigned quietly. Others clung to position and argued that the measures had been clumsy but necessary. The committee listened and recorded. They asked for more documents and more names. No one could predict how much further the web of influence reached. In the middle of all this, my wife continued to work the evidence like a careful gardener tending fragile seedlings. She cross-referenced invoices with vehicle sightings. She matched handwriting to printed notes. She found a pattern in the timing of the envelopes that suggested coordination with certain board meetings. Her notes were meticulous, and they began to form a narrative that legal counsel could use. She met with the committee behind closed doors and explained the operational methods of intimidation. Her calm explanations made the committee members sit up straighter. Her work changed scattered proof into coherent allegations. A turning point came when a member of the board who had been quiet at first unexpectedly confessed during a closed interview. He admitted to being part of a subgroup that had handled complaint escalation offline. He said they had believed they were protecting the neighborhood. He said the plan had started as a desire to be more proactive. He said it had spiraled into something ugly. His confession did not absolve him. It only added to the official record and to the committee report that was now forming in pieces. The atmosphere of the neighborhood continued to shift. Patio conversations turned to policy. People who had once accepted the board decisions now demanded transparency and votes. Homeowners began to attend board meetings in numbers not seen for years. They asked for reforms. They proposed external audits. A local paper picked up the story and ran a measured piece about community governance and about the dangers of unchecked authority. The public attention put an additional layer of pressure on ears that had once been deaf to complaint. Legal options multiplied. The attorney we had retained prepared a list of potential claims ranging from harassment to conspiracy to misuse of association funds. He warned us that legal battles are long and expensive. He explained the standards of proof and the tests courts would apply. He suggested settling on clear demands, including removal of certain board members' disclosure of contractor lists and reimbursement of legal fees for victims of harassment. The plan was pragmatic. It was also bitter. The suggestion that neighbors would sue each other for behavior that had begun as petty enforcement spoke to how badly the social fabric had frayed. Amid the official motion and the legal brewing, a quieter human element remained. Some neighbors reached out in letters and in late-night phone calls. They apologized and they asked for forgiveness. They said they had been scared into silence. They said they had wanted to keep peace even when the peace was false. Those conversations did not erase the damage. They did not return the lost afternoons or the sleepless nights. But they did open small doors toward reconciliation that might one day lead to repair. The committee continued its work methodically. They compiled a preliminary report that outlined practices that had been used to apply pressure. They recommended immediate suspension of any informal patrol arrangements. They suggested an independent audit of finances. They recommended that bylaws be clarified to prevent private enforcement without documented authority. The recommendations read like a manual for prevention. They also read like a rebuke to a small group that had sought control. The leaks and the committee report changed the game. The neighborhood had moved from fear to action. People were no longer waiting for a single decision from a board that had acted in shadow. They were organizing. They were speaking. They were bringing facts into light. The slow drip of evidence had become a stream that could not be stopped by polite denials. The path ahead was long and difficult. The wounds ran deep. But for the first time since the SUV first rolled into the street, there was a real sense that accountability might be possible. The committee's preliminary report spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. Copies passed from porch to porch. Neighbors underlined sections and circled names. Some read with satisfaction while others read with growing dread. The tone had shifted completely. The board could no longer brush off the accusations as misunderstandings. Their names were in print. Their practices were documented. Their methods were exposed. The first formal step came in the form of suspension notices. 2 board members were placed under temporary removal, pending investigation. Their access to financial accounts was revoked. Their authority to issue citations was stripped. They were told they could not attend meetings as decision-makers. For the first time, the power they had wielded with arrogance was taken from their hands. The reaction was immediate. One of them erupted in fury. He shouted in the meeting hall that the community would collapse without his leadership. He pointed fingers and accused others of betrayal. His words grew louder until the gavel struck again and again. Residents stood and walked out rather than listen. The image of his rage would not fade quickly. It marked him as guilty in the eyes of many. The other suspended member tried a different approach. He appeared calm and he spoke softly. He said everything had been a misunderstanding. He said his only goal was safety. He said he had followed advice given by others. He played the role of the victim. But the committee had his signature on invoices and his name on communications. His calm tone could not erase the paper trail. Meanwhile, my wife worked with the attorney to prepare a formal complaint. Contained pages of evidence. It detailed every envelope, every surveillance incident, every intimidation attempt. It cross-referenced contractor payments with vehicle sightings. It included witness statements from neighbors who had remained silent for too long. It was no longer just our story. It was the story of a neighborhood taken hostage by a handful of people who had mistaken authority for ownership. The complaint was filed with the county clerk. That act alone carried weight. Placed the dispute on public record. It meant that outside eyes would review the allegations. It meant that lawyers on the other side would have to respond in writing. The shield of secrecy shattered. Word spread even further when a local reporter published a second piece. This time, it was not a quiet feature on governance. It was a front-page story headlined "Homeowners Battle HOA Over Secret Patrols." The article described our encounters in vivid detail. It quoted the leaked text messages. It mentioned the SUV parked for hours in silence. It described the committee report that warned of financial mismanagement. The names of suspended members appeared in print. The story left little room for denial. As copies of the newspaper landed on driveways, the shift in atmosphere was unmistakable. People who had once defended the board now stepped back. Vendors who had worked with the association began to question unpaid invoices. Contractors refused new work until clarity returned. Insurance providers demanded explanations before renewing coverage. The machinery that kept the association running began to stall. The board scrambled. Emergency meetings were called. Attorneys were hired at great expense. Statements were drafted and then retracted. Rumors swirled that one member was considering resignation before charges could escalate. Another was said to be negotiating privately to avoid deeper exposure. The sense of control that had once been their greatest weapon had slipped away. Through all of this, I remained cautious. Victory was not yet certain. Retaliation was still possible. Shadows still lingered in late-night corners. But the balance had shifted. The board was no longer the hunter. They were the cornered. The day came when the HOA conflict could no longer be contained within fences and meeting halls. It moved into the courthouse. The building stood with its stone columns and heavy wooden doors as if carved to hold centuries of disputes. But when I walked inside with my wife at my side, it felt personal. The echoes of our footsteps carried the weight of every sleepless night and every whispered threat. The first hearing was procedural. Attorneys from both sides stood before the judge and outlined their positions. Our attorney spoke of intimidation and harassment. He described false violations fabricated to pressure us. He described unauthorized contractors who patrolled the neighborhood like shadow enforcers. He described envelopes slipped into mailboxes with no traceable origin. His voice carried the authority of evidence. The HOA's attorney responded with polished words. He said the board had acted in good faith. He said the community rules were clear and that enforcement was their duty. He said any misunderstandings were the result of poor communication. He tried to paint us as overreacting troublemakers. But when the judge asked him to produce proof of authorized contracts, his folder looked thin. He shifted on his feet. His confident mask cracked just slightly. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Cameras clicked as neighbors whispered in small groups. Some avoided eye contact with me. Others offered quiet nods of support. The story was no longer private. It had become a matter of public curiosity. The whispers of intimidation were now headlines about governance gone wrong. In the weeks that followed, depositions began. Board members were called to give sworn statements. My wife and I sat across the table as lawyers asked sharp questions. One by one, the cracks widened. A member admitted he had signed off on cash payments without receipts. Another admitted he had knowledge of the SUV but claimed he thought it was a legitimate patrol. Another hesitated before answering and then invoked legal counsel to avoid further response. Each moment added to the picture of a board that had operated in shadows and now squirmed under light. The most powerful moment came when the subcontractor who had slipped notes into mailboxes gave his deposition. His voice shook as he described being told to frighten homeowners. He said he had been given lists of houses to target. He said he had been warned not to answer questions if confronted. He said he had done it because he needed money but that he regretted every step. Tears formed in his eyes as he admitted he had never known the intimidation would spiral so far. His testimony pierced the room like a blade. The judge ordered a preliminary injunction. The board was forbidden from issuing new violations until the case was resolved. They were forbidden from hiring outside contractors. They were required to turn over all financial records for review. In that single order, the power dynamic flipped completely. The tools they had used to control us were stripped away. The community reacted with a mixture of relief and unease. Some celebrated openly. They decorated their porches with lights and flags as small acts of rebellion. Others worried what would come next. They feared the association would collapse entirely. They wondered if property values would fall. They wondered if outside management would be forced on them. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation. For me, the victory was not about property values. It was about dignity. It was about standing against intimidation. It was about showing that rules do not excuse cruelty. But I also knew the battle was far from over. Court cases stretch like long shadows. Appeals linger. Negotiations drag. The board still had allies who whispered in corners. The story was not yet finished. My wife remained steady. She analyzed each deposition. She mapped connections between payments and actions. She built timelines that showed deliberate escalation. Her training allowed her to see patterns others missed. She reminded me that truth moves slowly, but it moves forward. The courthouse was full the morning of the final judgment. Neighbors crowded into the gallery, whispering behind their hands. Reporters sat with notebooks open, ready to record every word. Board members who once strutted with authority now looked small in their suits. They avoided each other's eyes. They avoided ours. The weight of months of evidence sat on every bench and in every folder stacked high on the tables. The judge entered with slow, deliberate steps. The gavel struck once. Silence filled the room. What followed was not a dramatic burst of shouting or a surprise witness. It was the steady, careful reading of findings built piece by piece through investigation. The judge spoke of financial records that did not balance. She spoke of contracts signed without authorization. She spoke of patrols that had no legal basis. She spoke of intimidation carried out under the cover of community rules. Each point fell like a hammer blow. The words echoed in the wood-paneled chamber, and the faces of the suspended board members grew paler with every sentence. The ruling was clear. The board had exceeded its authority. The use of private intimidation was unlawful. The collection of false fines was invalid. All pending violations against homeowners were dismissed. Restitution was ordered for those who had paid under pressure. An independent management company would oversee the association until new elections could be held. Then came the personal consequences. 2 board members were barred from holding any future office within the association. One was referred for criminal investigation over misuse of funds. Another was ordered to repay money funneled through fake invoices. The remaining members were formally censured. The court's language was sharp. It spoke of abuse of power and betrayal of trust. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some neighbors covered their mouths in shock. Others whispered in relief. A few sat stone-faced, unwilling to show reaction. For me, it was like a heavy door finally opening after being locked for too long. I felt air rush into my chest. I felt the grip of fear loosen. Outside, the courthouse reporters swarmed. Microphones were pushed toward us. Questions flew about what it felt like to win. I answered carefully. I said it was not about winning. It was about accountability. I said communities deserve leaders who serve not rule. I said my wife and I had only wanted peace and fairness. Her presence beside me drew even more attention. Whispers spread quickly that she was the FBI agent whose quiet resolve had held the line. The cameras captured her calm expression and the quiet strength in her eyes. The fallout in the neighborhood was immediate. Signs that once demanded compliance were taken down. Neighbors gathered in small groups to talk about reforms. Children played freely on lawns without parents worrying about citations. The mood shifted from tension to cautious hope. But scars remained. Friendships had been broken. Trust had been shaken. The memory of fear lingered in corners of conversation. At night, the street was quiet again. No SUV idled in the dark. No envelopes appeared in the mailbox. I stood on the porch with the light glowing steady. My wife stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine. She said the storm had passed but warned that storms always leave debris. She said it would take time for the community to rebuild. The judge's order was final. The board that once tried to rule through fear had been dismantled. The case had proven what we already knew in our hearts. Power unchecked always turns dangerous. But courage and truth can bring it down. The story that began with a knock on my door ended with a gavel in the courthouse. What started as an HOA board trying to flex power turned into a lesson for an entire community. They thought intimidation would silence us. They thought secret patrols and false violations would break us. They thought we were alone. But the truth was stronger. The evidence was sharper. And courage spoke louder than fear. Neighbors who once whispered in silence found their voices. A subcontractor who once delivered threats came forward with truth. A board that thought itself untouchable faced judgment in public. And an association that had slipped into shadow was forced back into the light. For me, this was never just about grass height or porch lights. It was about dignity. It was about reminding those in power that rules are not weapons. They are responsibilities. My wife stood with me every step. Her calm resolve, her training, her strategy turned fear into a plan. Together we showed that intimidation has limits. Together we proved that standing firm matters. The neighborhood now feels different. The air is lighter. Children play without parents fearing citations. Neighbors wave without glancing over their shoulders. Meetings are filled with questions and with accountability. The scars remain, but scars are proof of survival. They are proof that we endured. If you take one lesson from this story, let it be this. Never believe you are powerless in your own home. Never let fear dictate silence. Never accept intimidation as normal. Communities are meant to be shared, not ruled. They are meant to protect, not control. If you watched this story until the end, I want to thank you. Your time means everything. And I want to ask you something simple. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in my place. Would you have fought back? Would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have found another path? Your words matter. Your voice matters.